Hello, friends, and welcome. My name is Katie Grosh, and I'm the Faith Initiative Coordinator at Grace Farms Foundation. And I'm so glad that you're able to be with us this afternoon for a conversation with Peter Bouteneff on his book, How to Be a Sinner, Finding Yourself in the Language of Repentance. This conversation is part of the Books on Faith and Meaning series, oriented around the Faith Initiative's core question, which we think is the treasure of the Faith Initiative. And this question is, what is the shape of flourishing life? As we engage with these different books, we want to ask how these texts can help us make progress in our quest to understand this fundamental question about the shape of flourishing life for ourselves and for our communities. Now, our assumption is that reading is never enough, but at the same time, these texts can nevertheless give us access to people, to histories, to ideas that, if we allow them to do their work on us, can contribute substantially to our quest. And so, before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. So first, this webinar is being recorded so that we can share this conversation with a broader audience in addition to all of you who are with us live. And secondly, if you are with us live today, please feel free to use the Q&A function at any point during the discussion. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible and speak to them throughout the conversation. So no need to wait till the end to ask your questions, just type them in the chat as they occur to you. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Matthew Croasmun, the Faith Initiative Director at Grace Farms.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Katie said, today we're talking about a book that has a rather provocative title, How to Be a Sinner. You know, one of the core questions that we take on in our Life Worth Living class that we teach from time to time here at Grace Farms, we sort of try to break down in that class this big question about what is the shape of flourishing life. One of the key questions that we always make sure to return to is the question, what should we do when we fail? What should we do when we fail to live the sort of life that we take to be most worthy of our shared humanity? It's often struck me that, you know, that this is an inevitable question, and like most inevitable questions, we often put together some sort of shortcuts to try to avoid them. In the case of this question, I take it one of those shortcuts is to say, well, maybe if I can't live up to this vision of life to which I feel responsible, maybe, I mean, in that sort of moment, I feel caught. I feel like a hypocrite. The sort of easier way around that, the easiest way out, I suppose, at that point is to resolve our hypocrisy. We can just change our ideals to match the lives we already live. I've taken that route from time to time. It's always tempting. And with the sort of specter of that sort of shortcut in the background, I've always thought that maybe it's actually a mark of a certain sort of moral courage to dare to live in something like hypocrisy, to live knowing that the life you live falls short of your own moral ideals. Maybe there's actually something courageous about continuing to hold to ideals that of which we inevitably fall short. I think it's something like this idea is behind our motivating and driving our book for today, How to Be a Sinner by Peter Bouteneff. Peter is a professor of systematic theology at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. He is author of many books, and we are so excited to have him with us today. I'll just mention a few of these books: Sweeter Than Honey, Orthodox Thinking on Dogma and Truth, and another book sort of near and dear to my heart, Arvo Pärt, Out of Silence, a study in the great Estonian composer's theology that's been hailed as a triumph, a game changer, a must read for any listener or performer of Pert's music. His book, How to Be a Sinner, has been a bestseller on its press, and we're just so glad to have Dr. Peter Bouteneff joining us this afternoon. So Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much. It's a joy to be with you. It's always a joy to be involved with anything at Grace Farms, and you and I have a history before that as well of some wonderful encounters and conversations. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm excited. I'm excited to dig in here. This is language, as you acknowledge throughout the book, language of sin, of being a sinner. That's really sort of fraught language, and many of us may, maybe we did, maybe our parents did, maybe our grandparents sort of jettisoned this language, or maybe it's just never been a part of a cultural or religious expression that we've been a part of. So I wonder if you could maybe we could just start out with some really basic questions and help us sort of get ourselves oriented here. When you use the word, what do you mean by sin? What is sin?
Yeah, like, I'd say even on the way to that, I'm glad you've already begun introducing the fraught nature of the language, and I'm sure that in our time together this afternoon, we'll unpack some of that and speak very candidly about the problems of sin language, the potential for it to kind of devolve into neuroses and self-loathing and masochism, all kinds of really bad things that nobody wants, and that has been exploited, in the name of sin language, And so I think we do well to have a kind of a radar that says, wait a minute, let's not get obsessed here with sin or repentance and all that. And yet, as you also seem to suggest, there is something potentially healing to an acknowledgement of self-scrutiny, what happens when we fail, and even asking that kind of question.
Mm-hmm.
There's something positive about it. And so I'd say, like, in the simplest way possible, sin for me means a combination of at least two things. And one would be specific things that I think or do that are clearly contrary to the way things are, the way things actually are, and the way things ought to be, right? And some of these things are fairly universal across cultures. I think humans have pretty well figured out that it's wrong to kill one another, that it's wrong to lie to one another, and it's wrong to be unfaithful maritally. It's just plain wrong, and kind of contrary to flourishing life. To use the language that you have so beautifully kind of put into play. And so sin on the one hand is, you could say, violations of our own and other people's flourishing. So that's one thing. Like, there's actually things that we do and think on those levels, and those things reach far and wide. I think human beings are so deeply connected across space and time that there is no such thing as a victimless crime. Anything I think or do that is messed up affects the whole cosmos in some way. And that leads to my second kind of definition of sin, which is that it is not just a thing that I do or think, that's kind of messed up, but it's an existential condition. So I can speak of myself as a sinner, as problematic as that can be, but I can speak that language accurately in terms of both of those definitions. I've done and said things, and I have a kind of a propensity towards some kinds of ways of thinking and being that are contrary to flourishing. And as part of that picture, because we're so interconnected, I am a part of that whole existential condition that is kind of falling short of flourishing. So, maybe we could, the next thing we can talk about is what's flourishing. And that's obviously something that you, in many of your own initiatives, Matt, have devoted some beautiful attention to. And so in a way, these two themes maybe have something to say to each other.
Yeah, no, and that seems important to say, that both philosophically and theologically, we would want to say the good always takes priority. So we don't know sin apart from some account of the good, and the good for human beings presumably is flourishing life, flourishing life, which in a theological tradition, in the Christian theological tradition, is going to be life lived with God, life lived sort of at home with God, perhaps, in some deep way. And so, so I appreciate that sort of thought that sin might describe these two things. So there's, maybe even talk about it. I'm just for someone on our audience who may not know, I'm a Paul scholar by training, but your two different parts of your definition sort of sound like some of the ways that St. Paul might describe. He could use sins in the plural, very, very occasionally, but he can. Misdeeds, things that we do counter to our own, and to, most importantly, to the flourishing of others and to the flourishing of the creation. Mm-hmm. But then there's also this thing that Paul talks about quite often as sin in the singular, maybe even with a capital S, some sort of condition or maybe even power that holds.
Yeah.
Now, Paul sort of pushes it in that direction, not just an existential condition, but maybe even a sort of power that sort of holds us under its sway. And I have to say, in my sort of contemporary imagination, when I think about huge systems of patriarchy or of white supremacy or large class systems, it's almost hard not to start to think, oh, maybe Paul was onto something, that there's something more pervasive, that it's somehow both, it's individual, it's social, but it's also, you say existential, I might push it even to some sort of power that that sounds like magical thinking, maybe, in a modern moment. But how do you make room for that sort of talk?
Of course, yeah. Didn't Reinhold Niebuhr say that sin is the one empirically verifiable doctrine of Christian faith? It's like everybody, people may not agree that there is a God. People may not agree that there is a Son of God, Jesus. They may not agree, but they can sure agree that things are messed up, and that there is, like, as you and Paul have said, there's kind of a force, as it were, that sometimes we feel very, very deeply, and we often feel it deeply, either in our own very intimate relationships, but also when we read the news and when we are aware of injustice, of mass incarceration, of systemic racism, of, it's powerful and it's corporate. And I suppose, bringing it back to the language of me as sinner, that it would be all too easy to kind of place the blame on the other, or on some kind of vague notion of society. But G.K. Chesterton was once famously asked, what's wrong with the world? And he said, I am, which it sounds like either like an inflated sense of self-importance, like a solipsism, like, what happens in my heart, that's the way of the world. But what he meant was, again, that kind of sense of deep, deep interconnectivity, A, and B, the only member of society that I really have a kind of a responsibility for and a say over is myself. So, and that gets spelled out in pop culture all over the place, be the change you want to be, all that, it's like, Michael Jackson, look at the man in the mirror, whatever, wherever you want to go. I think there's an intuition that realizes that that society is broken, and that a part of that brokenness is me. And furthermore, the only part that that, again, like I said, I'm responsible for and can really do something about is me. So that's where the center language can maybe be helpful or not.
Yeah. Yeah, no. So that seems like a way in potentially, that there's a recognition and you only need to spend 5 minutes on Twitter to realize that we have no lack of an ability in our cultural moment to be able to point out things that are wrong in the world. But sin language gives us an opportunity to recognize our own participation, our own culpability, to recognize the role that we play in contributing to much of what is wrong in the world. We can start to take some ownership of our own role. But as you come back to again and again in this book, and I really appreciate it's a real sort of, it's almost like a really good counselor or therapist. You're like constantly coming back to this possibility that this language of sin could lead to a sort of neurosis. And you could see where precisely that way in could be the way into like a profound sort of never-ending sense of guilt that just keeps coming on. So I look out in the world, and maybe there's something good about owning my piece of it, but it could quickly become overwhelming. How do we come to know ourselves as sinners without falling into neurosis or sort of getting lost in never-ending guilt?
Good question. I could really be a therapist now and say, well, what do you think? No, but wouldn't that be tidy? I think one way out of that is to be aware that the problem exists, to be aware that that there's a potential for this guilt and repentance thing to go south and to become neurotic and obsessive and self-loathing. And so an awareness of that potential helps us sort of be on the lookout for it, as it were. I think also there's a communal dimension to this, that if we can out ourselves with another person or other people, and that can take all kinds of forms. There's a formal way, and that is, in some churches there's kind of person-to-person confession, where you kind of air your sins, your fallings short, your baggage, as it were, to a person who not only kind of he's kind of an accountability partner, but he's also an accountability senior, as it were, and can maybe offer some words of counsel. That can also take the form of some kinds of counseling and therapy. It can also take the form of what a lot of people call like a soul friendship. And I have a friend who says everybody should have at least one person who knows everything about me, who knows everything about them, like just so that there's no kind of like shame spiraling going on inside. There's no kind of like festering, or as little as possible, of this kind of inner whirlpool that where things fester and get fetid, so that there's an airing of these things. And often that person can simply just be an active listener and not even say anything. But sometimes that person can say, I think you may be taking this in a self-destructive direction.
Yeah.
Especially if that person has some kind of training or proven experience in this kind of accompaniment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and it can
one of the ways.
Yeah, it can be deeply honoring, those sorts of, I often think of a conversation I had with a slightly older friend, quasi-mentor, I suppose at that point in my life, straight up mentor, who she saw me doing something in my life, and it was something else that was happening in public, so I didn't need to disclose it. She just saw it, And I'll never forget the way she phrased it. She said to me, Matt, that behavior is just unbecoming of you.
Mm.
And it was so I'm about to use like some really old-timey language, but like it felt so chastening. Right. It definitely, like, boy, and that lands deep. But on the other hand, it felt so honoring, actually, because it was like she knew some better version of me that in many respects I had yet to sort of realize in the world, but to whom she was holding me accountable. But the fact that she saw that was so beautiful. And so it was this thing, yeah, it felt chastening, but affirming somehow all at once, right? Because it was her saying, oh, in that way that like a mentor can, right? Of like, oh, you can do better. I know you can do better. And I'm not going to let you sort of, and I feel like I knew what that was for many years to get that from my piano teacher about, oh, you can practice harder, you can play harder, you can, but in the moral realm, right? To have that sort of encouragement,
Awesome.
it somehow, oh, sorry.
Pastoral gift, that she could do that without breaking you, and that also she clearly said this knowing that you had a certain trust in her. If you just go up to somebody on the street and say you're doing something bad, it's like, screw you, but if it's somebody who you've built a relationship with, and also that she put it in this kind of positive language, like, you are good,
Yeah.
uh, be who you really are, be your true self, be your better self. It's wonderful. That's true accompaniment where you don't break the other. There's a passage keeps coming to mind through our conversation, since you're a Paul scholar. It's in one of the Corinthian letters, maybe the second, where he says, like, I know I really caused you all grief in my letter, like where I chastened y'all. And then he says, there's two different kinds of grief. You recognize it, right? So there's godly grief and there's worldly grief. And so what's godly grief? He says it's godly grief, which maybe we can associate with, even with like a terrifying word like shame. It's something that, it's like a barometer that says, okay, something's broken here, and we can pick up and get better. The illness has been diagnosed, the boil has been lanced, and now we can get better. That's the kind of, if you're going to go grief, if you're going to go shame and guilt, let it be that kind which says, it's like a fever, it's like when you're ill, a fever is actually what gets you better. A fever is what gets your vessels kind of moving and expelling the infection, versus worldly grief, which is basically pure neurosis that it takes you nowhere but down.
So we've, and maybe I've done this, sort of pushed maybe into rather familiar territory of, trusted relationships with friends, with mentors, people that we trust and we sort of granted permission to. But you all, in particular sorts of ways, that's very relatable. But you also talk about just like confession, like in the Orthodox tradition. Yeah. And I don't want to move too quickly past that, because it strikes me that when you talk about the role of confession in your life and in the Orthodox tradition, you talk about it bringing a sort of, not just this sort of, someone sort of naming something and calling you forward, but you actually talk about a sort of a clearing of conscience, a sort of, I don't know if you would use theologically the language of absolution or something like this, but there's a sort of priestly function, it strikes me, that's sort of distinct. And for many outside the Christian faith, or many of us in Protestant traditions that don't really have any experience with confession, it all strikes us maybe as a little bit foreign. I wonder if you could talk about that sort of clearing of conscience, and what is that sort of priestly role of not just having an ear to listen, but someone who can sort of, I don't know, mediate divine forgiveness or something like this.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. All of your questions are good questions. Uh, I suppose, a question that often gets asked about the sacrament of confession, like as a rite, as a thing, like you set up a time and you go, and it tends to be done in a church building, and with with the clergy, vested in their clerical office, so they're there with that clear function in mind. And so the context of that airing is important, because it's very possible and also very healthy, I think, to be in the business of airing our conscience fairly regularly in different ways. Like I said earlier, like with friends, trusted people, um, and within oneself, just taking reflective moments, even a kind of a mindfulness meditation practice where you're mindful not only of exactly how and what your body is feeling at the moment in this space and in this time and in this silence, but to kind of allow that to be a moment for the airing of a kind of a detached, in a way, airing of what's swimming around in your conscience. So there's a place for that, but there's, I think, a place, at least in my ecclesiastical tradition of Orthodox Christianity, there is a place for that kind of sacramental moment where you are in the church building, and you're speaking it before someone who has a priestly function, and priesthood is by definition a kind of a mediatorial function, as you just said, mediating not guilt but forgiveness. Because that's the other piece of the puzzle here, how to acknowledge one's faults and one's kind of wrong orientations and everything, without it killing you and without it taking you down, is the memory that the consciousness that the God before whom we are guilty is a limitlessly loving, forgiving, merciful God. And so ideally the priest, the pastor, whatever it is, who's hearing you out on this, is someone who will mediate that rather than mediate someone who kind of in parental language is like poised to give you a spanking or to kind of now of course we all know also that positions of power, whether they're priestly or even therapists, etc., teachers, counselors, they are very tempting to abuse. People in power can often abuse that situation. So I just want to name that too, that's another, if I may, sin, the sin of the abuse of power. But ideally, like if the stuff is working as it should be, that power, that authority is in the name of the loving, merciful God who gives his self, who in some manner of speaking exists for us and for our flourishing.
That's really powerful. You say of confession that, of course, the problems don't necessarily evaporate. There may still be reparative work to do, behavior to change, and feelings to heal. But we can now address these with a clearer conscience, possibly with the committed cooperation of the person we trespassed against. And I was struck as I was reading that many in our day, and I'm thinking, again, maybe too much about the Twitterverse, but many might be quite worried about this idea that some sort of cleansing of the conscience might come before reparative work is done. Like we're letting ourselves off the hook somehow. But you seem to have the idea that this maybe partial clearing of the conscience can come first, and maybe even needs to come first. Why is that? Why shouldn't I be worried that we're just letting ourselves off the hook
Yeah.
too easy?
Well, that's another one that I think, at least half the battle is a consciousness of that tension and of that problem, and a consciousness that both are necessary. I always think back to the very gradual and very, very painful healing from apartheid in South Africa, and uh, Archbishop Desmond Tutu's brilliant prophetic naming of the committee as truth and reconciliation, that these are two things that have to be done. Truth has to be told about it. It can't simply be, let's all just hug it out
Mm.
because there was systemic murder and oppression, the likes of which most of us can't even fathom. And it has to be named. And it doesn't just go away. And sometimes, like, the whole forgiveness thing, like, sometimes all that can be is like, if I'm asking somebody to forgive me, uh, all I'm asking them for is, can we work on this? Not like, hey, can you just make this go away, make this problem go away? The fact that I uh, just about ruined your life with what I did.
Yeah.
Can't we just put that aside? No, we can't actually. But can we work on it? Can we pledge to spend however long it takes, and it may take years and years, can we pledge to try to speak the truth to each other and try to heal and presume each other's good intentions? Like, over time, can that be a part of what we try to do?
Yeah, and it strikes me that in those sorts of moments, then often the first move is not, will you forgive me? But the first question is, can you help me better understand the impact of my behavior on you, on your community, on
Yep.
those that I've harmed, and to understand that that's a genuine ask, and you're genuinely asking for a favor. You're genuinely asking for some help, right? Um, that the harmed party might actually offer back to you,
Mhm.
to help us first understand the impact of our behavior. This may be
Probably. Mhm.
relevant to a question that came in on Q&A, really important one here. Ask, how might a structural view of sin, in terms of describing social power structures, how would that map or apply to individual formation or responsibility without becoming a consuming or unproductive guilt rubric?
Yeah, that's just fantastic. Um, uh, I think it's always been a mantra of our conversation that awareness of the problem is half of the solution, but I don't want to just leave it at that. Um, I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but as part of my ecumenical work at the World Council of Churches, uh, I remember I was responsible for trying to. I, there had just been a spate of arson cases where Black churches in the South were being burned to the ground, and it was obviously, just a completely racist uh, spate of racist hatred. Um, and so we were trying to kind of compose prayers together to address this in the spirit of common prayer. And I remember, like, there was a debate: can we include within this prayer service a prayer of personal repentance, uh, that I, in any hatred that I have borne, that I, in any hatred that I have borne, that has some kind of racist dimension to it. Am I immune to racism? Do I really think I'm not part of that problem? You know, and there was a real lively debate. There were people who said, no, I didn't torch any church, you know. and I'm not racist. And there was others who said, well, I know, but don't isn't there like a spark within me that is cut from the same cloth as that hatred? Like if you just kind of amplified it a little bit, it would go the same place, you know? And so it's a very difficult thing. Like on the one hand, you don't want to artificially take responsibility for every societal problem. But on the other hand, I think there's a certain personal honesty that where I can see myself capable of that level of hatred. You know, it's like when Christ says, you know, you've heard it say, do not kill, but I say to you, don't even be angry. Because, you know, anger plus time and you know, taken to the next power leads to murder. You know, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I say, don't even like look at somebody with the kind of the fantasy of violation, because that's where it goes. You know, and so I suppose to acknowledge, on the one hand, not to place the blame for every societal ill on others, but rather locate it within oneself. But as the questioner said, not to turn that into a yet another kind of self-loathing, spiraling shame thing.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that another possibility there is that if guilt becomes overwhelming, then our engagement, I'm placing myself in the position of the one who has caused harm. If I am overwhelmed by my own sense of guilt, then my interactions, even with those whom I have harmed, can become sort of selfishly oriented toward the relief of my own guilt. And what I really need, right? I mean, I think we see this in sort of racialized structures, right, where woke white folk walk around desperately trying to get, you know, black folk to sort of absolve them, right? Like, I just need someone to tell me that, like, I'm not that bad, or that they.
Right.
And you've turned the impact not only of your, in that case, racist behavior, you've compounded that with a sort of a guilty neediness, right? To sort of have someone now sort of speak to an innocence that you never, from a Christian theological point of view, you never had to begin with, and is not in anyone's place to sort of offer you. And again, if we've learned how to like know ourselves as sinners and find that nevertheless a productive place to be, there may be a way out, it seems to me, in what you're describing, of that whole cycle of, to stick with the racial example, of sort of racialized harm followed by recognition, and then a sort of demand then of a sort of a declaration of racial innocence, which is just never going to be truthful if we're oriented around that guilt and trying to escape an identity that maybe would actually be freeing if we were willing to own it and waste your time.
The other corrective I'd offer myself is like, if I do recognize any kind of a sin, like if I recognize the seed of it in myself, on the one hand, that's very humbling, and that helps me forgive the other in a certain way. But I don't think it lets me off the hook from calling out injustice. You know, yes, I may be someone who has anger and unresolved, you know, whatever, and I haven't got the race thing settled and figured out in my own heart. But that fact shouldn't stop me from acting out in the service of, in the redressing of societal injustice, in the redressing of societal racism, in demonstrating, in finding appropriate ways to call it out, you know, right? So the fact that I am in some way guilty of everything doesn't mean that, I just ignore society and its ills. No, I have to be part of the solution, even if part of the solution is also working on myself.
Mm,
Part of the solution is also making society better,
mm.
you know.
I've been struck over the years that that the 12-step community may have some real insights into what it means to own a sort of identity of this sort. And so I was so excited to see you take up sort of the 12-step model in your book. I wonder if you just sort of lay out for us some of like how is 12-step thinking sort of helpful in trying to understand what it might mean to know ourselves as sinners.
Uh, my knowledge of it and experience with it is slight. I but what I know from very close friends who are very deeply involved uh, is that a lot of what's going on in the 12 steps is an acknowledgement of one's illness
Mm.
and a surrender of that to the higher power in the community of others, uh, and a constant work to uh, address this illness in one's own life. Uh, and one way that came up is like, with the language of sinner, I kind of I problematize that language in the book. I say, wait a minute, we're not supposed to use like negative language about ourselves.
Mm.
Or almost any, it was like I'm happiest when I don't use any sort of really fixing identity language about myself that would kind of enshrine an identity about myself. I'm bad at sports. Like, don't say that about yourself. you know get out there and play. um, so if I say I'm a sinner, is that basically enshrining a sinner identity in me? Well, the 12-step folks know very well the importance of, first thing you'll say at a meeting, hello, I'm David and I'm an alcoholic. you know I'm an addict.
Mm.
It's an acknowledgement of that. It's a diagnosis. Now, to be an alcoholic or to be a gambling addict or to be a sex addict, whatever, that in itself is not a sin.
Mm.
To have that condition, any more than it's a sin to suffer from depression, which is not a sin, right? Nor is it a sin to, have cancer or COVID or anything, right? You could say these are in some way part of the brokenness of humanity, but it's not a personal sin to be an alcoholic. Uh, but to acknowledge that this is my condition is a huge part of the way out of the condition.
Yeah.
You could say it's like a qualifying step, you know.
And it strikes me that much of, again, Paul's language, I think other sort of biblical language as well about sin is often, it's a sort of addiction phenomenology. It's not just that I occasionally fall short. It's that I have a sort of, almost sort of addicted to false ways of being in the world. And that seems like a fruitful analogy so far as it goes, at least, in sort of thinking about what this bizarre Christian claim is,
Yeah.
about the sort of that the human being is both the good creature, good creation, good creature of God, and yet also sinner. In fact, you at some point talk about you go to great lengths to make sure that we're clear that in saying that we are both good, created good, and yet know ourselves as sinners, those aren't two different people. That's not a divided identity. That's not inside and outside. We're somehow one integrated person. Why
Yeah.
is that important to know ourselves that way? And yeah, and how can we know ourselves that way?
Well, because it's tempting to sort of say, there's a good Peter and a bad Peter, or, the cartoon depiction of the demon speaking to one ear and the angel speaking to the other. And as we all know, again, Paul, as a Paul person, I think in Romans 7, is it, where he says, the things that I want to do right, I don't do. It's like and he even says there's me and then there's sin in me.
Mm.
But what's cool is that he acknowledges that there's a me, and he even says, in my innermost self, I delight in the law of God. What's the law of God? It's, like I said earlier, it's the way things are. It's reality. It's truth. You know, um, whatever is true, whatever is worthy of praise, whatever is honorable, whatever is beautiful, as he says in Philippians. Um, so in my inmost self, in me, what I really am for is this. And yet there's this sort of like bacillus, there's this sort of, you know, a deep influence.
Mm.
It's not wrong to associate it with addiction, like you just
Mm.
did, Matthew. You know, and maybe it's not even such a bad idea to sort of see it as a kind of as an other thing.
Mm.
You know, I'm reading Martin Laird right now, Into the Silent Land, and I've rarely been so affected by a book. It is absolutely stunning. Check it out. Interview him. Much better than me. But he speaks about this kinds of thing as seeing sin or seeing fear as an other that you can even name. Like you can give it a name, like Frank or something, so that you are. It's not an actual. It doesn't define you.
Uh,
You are its witness. You're not its victim, right?
uh.
You can observe. Yeah, look at that. You know, uh, and you're not like a helpless victim of it.
That's really interesting, and actually sort of reminds me of certain sorts of. Before we started the call, I was mentioning the work of Pema Chodron on this. She has a lot to say about sort of how we might think about categories like repentance. She's not a big fan of the word sin, but she does have quite a lot to say about the importance of that sort of observation of oneself in these sorts of moments, and just
Yeah.
and taking that that sort of almost third party view
Yeah,
of adopting that for a moment and saying, why
semi-detached.
do I respond this way? Like, what is that about? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Where did that come from?
Not like, oh my God, how can I, of all people, have this sullied thought? No, just kind of be detached about it.
Mm,
Even maybe with a little sense of humor, never hurts.
mm.
Um, you know,
Well, this is good because this sort of gets into another. I got like two questions I'd love to ask you before our time's up. But one of them, I was, as you will know, maybe some others won't. I've spent a lot of time thinking over the last few years about emotions, about joy in particular. But once you start thinking about joy, you start thinking about all sorts of other parts of the emotional life. And you have some really striking emotional language in this book. You talk about the sweetness of compunction, which I mean, compunction itself is just like, I'm not sure I could define compunction, standing on one foot or even on two. Or you talk about bright sadness. And it strikes me that there are these entire emotional or affective sort of realities that we might not be familiar with if we don't know ourselves in the sorts of ways that you're talking about. Or maybe a positive way of saying it would be, there's this whole sort of like emotional palette sort of available to the life of the one who knows oneself as a sinner, is receiving forgiveness and living into new sorts of life. Maybe we can just start with like, what's compunction and why would it be sweet?
Okay. Yeah. I suppose compunction, could we call it a kind of a state of gentle mourning, like MOUR, mourning for the brokenness of our life. And I think gentle is kind of important there, so that again, it doesn't become devastating. So the sweetness of compunction, I think, I like, there's of course the kind of the what's composite word of bright sadness, but there's one word, bittersweet, which I think is such a beautiful word because it describes, you know, there's no unmitigated joy, but neither ideally is there unmitigated sorrow or grief that somehow in the balance of things where all of creation is good and you and I and everyone listening and everyone is made in the image of God and good. And so the starting place, the substrate is all deeply good and holy. And yet, oh my God, is it, try not to use the F word, messed up, you know? It's inevitable that it's going to be bittersweet. And we can't go the one place without going to the other. Pop culture knows this, and some of the best pop culture there is, namely Pixar. You ever watch Pixar movies, man?
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, Inside Out is one of my favorite movies because it's a cartoon depiction of the role of grief in a flourishing life. Man, can you imagine the
The pitch
the
meeting
idea
crowd.
table? Yeah, like pitching that idea, like, hey, let's get an animated movie that speaks about the role of sorrow in joy. It's like, hey, what great idea. We'll get Amy Poehler in, right? So, but it works. It's such a perfect movie in that regard. It's so profound. So whether it's pop culture or you mentioned him, Arvo Pärt, and the music that kind of, for many people, kind of summons simultaneously compunction and mourning, but also hope and joy. It's like, wow, you're onto that. You've tapped into something very deep and true about our life. That both of these things are interwoven, and let's not give either of them short shrift. The fullness of life means go in there.
Yeah. Yeah. A quick note. What was the title of that book again? We had someone who was asking, you were recommending a book to me.
Into the Silent Land by Martin Laird.
Into the Silent Land. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So my last question for you. Later on in the book, you talk about the relationship between the mercy we understand ourselves to have received and the mercy that we are able to show others, and the relationship between those two. And it struck me that was a really, I sort of thought like, oh man, that's sort of the clincher. Why would I want to know myself this way? Because perhaps I could be a person of mercy. And I just actually, a good friend of mine and a colleague at the Divinity School, Abdul Rahman Malik, he teaches Islam at the Divinity School. He just gave a presentation to my undergraduates on trying to capture quickly sort of his take on a sort of Islamic view, a vision of the shape of flourishing life. And he summarized that life as a life of mercy. And sort of turning to this name of Allah, right, as the one who is most merciful, as sort of the center of his meditation. But it struck me that here is a sort of really rich picture of what life could be if we know ourselves as sinners. We might have a posture of mercy. So I just love for you to talk a little bit about that posture of mercy and how we might extend that to one another if we had this healthy view of ourselves, honest, truthful view of ourselves.
Yeah, it's kind of the people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones kind of a thing. It's like you realize your own vulnerability, and that it's humbling. It's humbling, and it ideally it lets you forgive other people more. Yeah, I mean, just the parable Jesus tells about this servant who owes his master big time. He's like, in today's dollars, I don't know how much it is, but all these denarius. a denarii that he owes, and the master, okay, forgives him entirely, but then that same servant like starts strangling the people beneath him that owe him like a pittance, you know. um, it's like, don't you realize how much mercy you've been shown, and can't you even give a little bit, you know, uh, when you realize, I suppose, that you are uh, given grace. Grace is by definition an undeserved uh, gift and an undeserved mercy. uh, so let's, you know, whether other people deserve it from us or not, let's give them mercy, and let go of our grudges, let go of our as much as we can. Let go, you know. One of the last things Jesus says to people in the flesh is the the sins you forgive of others are forgiven, and the sins you retain of others are retained. Which means that when we bear grudges, when we hold what's the word? When we have it against somebody, that has very cosmic implications, lasting implications, and that our life should be a constant process of taking joy in the salvation of others, taking joy in the flourishing of others, of surrendering them to God's mercy as we are surrendered to His mercy. What a great place to be, you know, because it's great for us, because grudges are burdensome for us too. They eat us up alive.
Yeah.
So if we can let that stuff go, everybody's happier. You know, other people don't need another judgmental Christian in the world. There's enough of us doing that. What they need is people with mercy. Yeah.
Peter, thank you so much. Thank you for the book. Thank you for the conversation. It's been a rich one. So thank you, my friend, for joining us.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone who's listening too.
Friends, thank you for joining us today. Next month, we're going to have a conversation with my friend and colleague at Wesleyan University, Steve Angle. He's a scholar of Chinese philosophy, and will be giving us an introduction to the Analects of Confucius, which are just an extraordinary ancient resource. Can be maybe a little intimidating to think like, I'm just going to sit down and read some Chinese philosophy today. But with Steve's help, Steve's helped me find my way into them. And I've found, ask some of my colleagues, I've become obsessed with Confucius. So Steve is a great person to introduce us to that. I hope you'll join us next month. And thank you again for joining us, and hope to see you then.